Hello everyone and welcome to episode 12 of my Lancastrians and Yorkists vlog. This time we are looking at the problems that arose towards the end of Edward IV's reign. This is the start of depth topic 4 in the EdXL unit if you're studying history A level, which they title as Yorkists Divided 1478 to 85, and the big focus here is on Richard III. And how he seizes power. But it does start in those just final couple of years of Edward IV's reign. And this is what the exam would say your main focus would be in this topic. They say it's on the dizzy changes in fortune of the House of York in these years. And crucially, here's the bit, the factors which brought this about. So you do need to think about why does Richard end up seizing the throne? Why do things fall apart after a fairly long and relatively successful reign of Edward IV. Now, we have jumped forward in time about 17 years between these two depth factors. And so we're just going to spend a few minutes in this episode thinking about what happened in that gap, getting ourselves a little bit of a sense of Edward IV's kind of the nature of his reign, and then also what the tensions were arising in the narrative leading into the late 1470s. So Edward IV, as you'll remember last time, seized the throne in battle in 1461 after victory at Towton. And after that victory, Margaret of Anjou, the Queen, and Henry VI, the King, fled to Scotland. And they skulked around there for a few years before trying to re-invade in 1464 unsuccessfully. And Henry VI actually went on the run and was at large in northern England for a while before getting captured by Edward IV in 1465 and put in the Tower of London for several years. Margaret of Anjou and her son Edward fled to France and waited there for an opportunity to enact revenge, whilst Edward got down to his reign. And his main aim in starting his reign was to reintroduce stability and to try and, I guess, bring a sense of calm and permanence to the country after years of battle and toing and froing. So he did pass 113 attainders, which are laws which basically condemn the target to death, the victim to death, and take all their lands. But a substantial number of those were later received pardons. He does let off key Lancastrian nobles. Percy is one of those who later betrays him. His aim, very much, as I said, was to stabilise the kingdom. Having said that, he does also reward his supporters enormously. He uses close friends and family, his regional magnates, particularly Warwick, and the symbols of royal authority are restored. He brings back the splendour of the kingship after those years of Henry VI, remember, kind of walking around looking poor, being poor, really. He improves the royal finances, not least through getting more of a grip on taxation and spending, but also, I guess, like the ending of the Wars of the Roses and the ending of the war against France have also helped, on which note he negotiates a truce with both France and Scotland and an alliance with Burgundy, which does cause some disquiet in certain quarters, as we'll come to next. Controversially, he married Elizabeth Woodville, and we'll come to that in a moment too, and this led to a massive falling out with Warwick, and then also a big falling out with his brother George, Duke of Clarence. So, moving into that, in 1464, Warwick had been dispatched to France to negotiate a marriage for Edward, which would bring with it an alliance with France. And he'd been working on that for about a year when he came back with the sweet smell of success in his nostrils, but only to kind of talk to Edward about it and find that, meantime, Edward had in secret already married Elizabeth Woodville. Now, this was bad on several fronts, really. She was English, which meant there was no sort of diplomatic kudos in the marriage. She had already been married, and her husband had died, and already had two sons, and that kind of went against the grain of what a queen was meant to be. And she came with a big family. And of course, for Warwick, there's also the personal humiliation that he's been sent out of the country. He, Warwick, the kingmaker, the most powerful noble in England, had been sent to France to negotiate this marriage, while all along Edward not only was thinking about getting married, had already got married. So this does lead to quite a big falling out. There's also falling out about foreign policy strategy here, that Warwick preferred a foreign French alliance rather, but Edward pursued an alliance with Burgundy and again negotiated for it behind Warwick's back and sealed it in 1467. So already we have a couple of reasons there for Warwick falling out with Edward IV, the secret negotiations, and then the disagreement over foreign policy. But there's also the Woodville factor. Woodville seemed to be everywhere in the 1460s and 70s. Elizabeth obviously was queen. Her father Richard became Lord Rivers. He was Lord High Treasurer. She had 5 brothers. The best example of how they kind of hoovered up opportunities for the nobility is how her brother John, who was 20 years old, was married off to the Duchess of Norfolk, incidentally Warwick's aunt, despite the fact that she was 65 years old. Probably not a love marriage, I imagine. Elizabeth also had 2 sons from her first marriage, as I'd mentioned earlier. One of those, the eldest, Thomas Grey, became the Marquis of Dorset. There was lots of reward, rightly so for them, but there was a contemporary feeling, justified or not, that they were, I guess in the modern phrase, gold digging. Anyhow, this is then contrasted to how there are limited opportunities for marriage for other nobilities. In 1469, George, Duke of Clarence, Edward IV's brother, asked for permission to marry Warwick's daughter, Isabel Neville, but was denied that opportunity by Edward IV, who saw it as being too powerful a match. He, in rebellion, along with Warwick, went to Calais and got married anyway. Warwick and Clarence then invaded England, taking advantage of a tax revolt in the north, maybe inspired by Warwick. They won the Battle of Edgecote, that's Edgecote, in July, and captured Edward IV. This is very reminiscent of what had happened to Henry VI. And they tried to rule the country with him as their prisoner. He sort of seems to have just kind of gone along with it. Ha ha ha, let's see what happens here. But the people wouldn't accept it. It was very unpopular. Edward IV was quite a popular king. So that was in 1469. And then again in March 1470, they have another sort of second go. Lord Wells, Welles, lost the Battle of Losecoat Field. And at that battle, it was found that Warwick had been involved in that rebellion as well, and Warwick and Clarence had to flee to France. And so they have a third go in 1471. And this is the big one, really. Warwick was running out of options. He had rebelled against the king. He'd been found kind of plotting to rebel against the king again. He'd fallen out with Edward. And so, in desperation, he, encouraged by the King of France, decided to ally with Margaret of Anjou and invade. This was huge. Warwick had literally acted against Margaret of Anjou for years and years and years, and deposed her husband, and now here he was trying to get him back on the throne. So they invaded, and Edward IV actually saw that this time he didn't have the strength to resist them, so he fled abroad, and this led to what's called the readeption of Henry VI in October 1470. He's brought out the Tower of London and back as king, reluctantly, I would say. He probably isn't mentally or physically up to being monarch at the time, but he's the figurehead of this rebellion. However, helped by Burgundy financially and with some troops, Edward IV returns with an army and comes in actually where Henry IV came in the Humber, marches south a bit, and then George, Duke of Clarence, betrays Warwick and goes and patches things up with Edward, and together Edward IV and George, Duke of Clarence, his brother, defeat Warwick, who's killed at the Battle of Barnet in April 1471, and this leads to the readeption of Edward IV. So you've got kind of 2 phases to Edward IV's reign, 1461 up to 1470, where things are initially quite calm but end in massive revolt, and then the 1470s from 71 upwards, where things are calmer. Shortly after winning the Battle of Barnet, Edward IV's forces won the Battle of Tewkesbury, And in that battle, poor old Prince Edward was killed. This is Margaret of Anjou and Henry VI's son. He was only 17. It was his first battle. But he was killed in that. And shortly afterwards, Henry VI died on the 21st of May, 1471. This was portrayed at the time as dying of a broken heart, but probably he was murdered on Edward IV's orders. All now the main threats to Edward IV have been removed. Warwick as the over-mighty subject, also Henry VI as the previous king, his son Edward as the de facto heir of Henry VI, all gone. And so the 1470s were calm, as I said. Edward gave Richard, his other brother, Richard of Gloucester, command of the Council of York. Richard gained Warwick's lands in the north. Clarence was brought back on board for a while. That run quite well. And Anthony Woodville, now Earl Rivers, ran the Council of Wales. As I say, things were pretty well established. However, there were growing tensions, and George, Duke of Clarence, having been naughty once, went on to be naughty twice, and we'll look at how that causes tensions and problems for Edward next time. Thanks for listening. See you soon.